The Black Sea Deluge. 7,600 years ago, the Black Sea was not a sea. It was a freshwater lake, vast and calm, sitting more than 150 meters below the surface of the Mediterranean. Its shores were green, its waters were clear, and along those shores lived thousands of people, farming the fertile soil, fishing the shallows, building homes they expected their grandchildren to inherit. They had no word for what was coming. They had no framework for it. One day the land at the Bosphorus held. And then, according to geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman of Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, it didn't. The Mediterranean poured in. Ryan and Pittman estimated the inflow at roughly 42 cubic kilometers per day, a volume 200 times the flow of Niagara Falls, crashing through the breach and cascading into the basin below. The lake level rose by approximately 15 centimeters every single day. That doesn't sound like much until you picture a flat shoreline and you realize that 15 centimeters a day across a nearly level plain means the water's edge moved not inches but potentially hundreds of meters inland every week. Within a year, coastlines that families had lived on for generations were underwater. Within decades, the lake the ancient inhabitants had known was gone, replaced by a saltwater sea that has never been fresh again. The geological evidence for this transition is not theoretical. It is visible in sediment cores pulled from the floor of the Black Sea at multiple independent sites across the basin. Below a certain layer, the cores contain freshwater mollusk shells, which specifically species like Dreissena, Rostroformis, and Monodacna caspia, organisms that can only survive in fresh water. Above that same layer, the sediment contains marine microfossils, organisms that require salt water. Radiocarbon dating of the last freshwater shells in those cores produces a date of approximately 7,600 years ago, placing the marine incursion squarely in the 6th millennium before the Common Era. The boundary between the two worlds is not gradual. In some cores, the transition occurs within centimeters. In sediment terms, centimeters represent years or decades, not centuries. Something happened fast. Sonar bathymetry has confirmed the existence of the ancient shoreline, now submerged at approximately 155 meters below the modern sea surface. The imaging reveals beach sand, wave-cut terraces, and abraded pebbles at depths consistent with a lake sitting exactly that far below the modern sea level. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who discovered the Titanic, led expeditions to the Black Sea in 1999 and 2000 using remotely operated vehicles. His teams identified what appeared to be worked timber, rectangular features, and carved stone objects near the ancient Sinop coastline at depths of approximately 90 to 150 meters. Whether these represent genuine human structures remains debated, but their location precisely along the submerged ancient shoreline is not easily dismissed. The total volume of water transferred from the Mediterranean into the Black Sea basin during this event has been estimated at approximately 80,000 cubic kilometers, roughly equivalent to filling one of the North American Great Lakes. That water came from somewhere outside, and it went somewhere new, and the people living along the basin's edge had nowhere to go but away. Researcher William Ryan has drawn connections between the displacement of these populations and the proposed dispersal of Proto-Indo-European language speakers from the Pontic steppe north of the Black Sea, beginning approximately 6,000 years before the Common Era, coinciding with the flooding event. If that connection holds, the languages spoken today across Europe, Iran, and the Indian subcontinent may carry the genetic memory of people who once farmed a freshwater shore and fled when the saltwater came. The mainstream geological view accepts the marine incursion as documented fact. The debate is about rate, Most current models favor a connection that developed over centuries or possibly millennia, a gradual infiltration rather than a catastrophic wall of water. The submerged structures identified by Ballard's team are treated cautiously, with most archaeologists considering their artificial origin unconfirmed pending targeted excavation. The linguistic connection to Indo-European dispersal is considered one hypothesis among several competing models for the spread of those languages across Eurasia. But the sharpness of the boundary layer is difficult to explain away. If the transition from fresh water to salt water occurred over thousands of years, the boundary in the sediment record should show mixing, gradation, a zone of overlap between freshwater and marine species. It doesn't. It shows a line between two worlds drawn in the sediment of a sea floor, precisely dated to 7,600 years ago. And something else sits in the boundary layer that deserves attention. The oldest written story ever discovered is the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Mesopotamian narrative predating the biblical account of Noah by at least 1,000 years. In it, a man named Utnapishtim is warned by a god that a great flood is coming. He builds a boat. The waters rise and cover everything. He comes to rest on a mountain. The waters recede. He steps out into a new world. The story appears not once but repeatedly across the ancient Near East, the Levant, the Indian subcontinent, and ancient Greece, told by cultures that did not share a written language but apparently shared a memory. Some researchers ask whether flood myths scattered across so many unconnected traditions represent theological allegory or whether they represent something older, a testimony carried in story across 7,000 years by people who descended from those who watched the water rise and ran. We may never know with certainty. But the line in the sediment is real. The submerged shoreline is real. And the oldest story humanity ever wrote down is about a flood that changed everything, told by a civilization that lived precisely where the water came from. The Bronze Age collapse. The year is 1200 before the Common Era. The Eastern Mediterranean is the most sophisticated, most interconnected trading network the ancient world has ever produced. While the Hittite Empire controls Anatolia with military power that forced Egypt itself to sign a peace treaty. Mycenaean Greece exports pottery and bronze to 3 continents. Ugarit, on the coast of modern Syria, is a cosmopolitan port city processing correspondence in 5 languages simultaneously, a trading hub connecting Mesopotamia to Cyprus to Egypt to the Aegean in a web of supply chains, diplomatic obligations, and mutual economic dependency. Cyprus is the global center of copper production. Egypt under Ramesses III is powerful, wealthy, and seemingly permanent. Every major civilization in the region has been building, trading, and growing for 300 years. Then, within 50 years, nearly all of it stops. Professor Eric Klein of George Washington University, whose 2014 book on the collapse synthesizes decades of archaeological and textual evidence, documents destruction layers dated to approximately 1200 to 1150 before the Common Era at more than 40 major sites across the eastern Mediterranean. The list reads like a roll call of the ancient world. Mycenae, Tiryns, Medea, Pylos, Thebes in Greece, Ugarit, Alalakh and Hazar in the Levant, Hattusa in Anatolia, Megiddo and Lachish in Canaan. Palace centers that had stood for centuries show burning, abandonment, and in many cases, no subsequent reoccupation. Populations in some Greek regions declined by an estimated 75 to 90% in the transition from the Mycenaean period to the subsequent Greek Dark Ages. Pylos, one of the great Mycenaean palace centers, was never rebuilt. Among the most haunting artifacts of the collapse is a clay tablet recovered from the ruins of Ugarit still in the kiln where it was being fired when the city was destroyed, around 1185 before the Common Era. The letter, addressed to the king of Alatia, reads, "My father, now the ships of the enemy have come and burned my cities with fire, and they have done evil things in my country. All my troops and chariots are in the land of Hittite." A reply from Cyprus was found in the same ruins, still sealed, never read. The exchange captures in 2 clay tablets the speed and totality of what happened. One civilization writing to another for help, neither surviving to receive an answer. The Mycenaean linear B writing system, used for centuries to administer palace economies across Greece, disappears from the archaeological record around 1200 before the Common Era and does not reappear in any form for approximately 400 years, when the Greek alphabet emerges from Phoenician script. An entire writing tradition gone. The Hittite capital at Hattusa in central Anatolia was burned around 1180 before the Common Era. But archaeological evidence suggests a planned evacuation rather than a battle defeat. The city appears to have been emptied before it was burned by its own people or by someone who moved through it, unopposed. The Hittite Empire, which had contested Egypt militarily as recently as 1274 before the Common Era at the Battle of Kadesh, simply ceased to exist within a generation. Bronze artifact analysis from the collapse period shows a dramatic shift toward lower quality copper alloys and recycled metal, consistent with the disruption of the long-distance tin trade network that had connected Afghanistan and Central Asia to the Mediterranean. Tin is not found in the Mediterranean basin. Every piece of tin bronze produced in the Mycenaean, Hittite, or Egyptian world required supply chains stretching thousands of kilometers. When those chains broke, the Bronze Age literally ran out of the material that gave it its name. Paleoecological data from pollen cores at multiple eastern Mediterranean sites, analyzed by researcher Brandon Drake in a 2012 paper in the Journal of Archaeological Science, shows a prolonged drought beginning approximately 1250 to 1100 before the Common Era, consistent with the southward shift of the Mediterranean storm track during this period. Egyptian records under Ramesses III, inscribed on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, describe invasions by a confederation he called the Sea Peoples, groups identified in the inscriptions as the Peliset, Checker, Shekelesh, Denian, and Weshesh. Their origin remains one of the most debated questions in ancient history, with proposed homelands ranging from the Aegean to Anatolia to Sicily to the western Mediterranean. Egypt repelled them, barely, and emerged from the collapse weakened but structurally intact. Almost every other major civilization in the region did not. The mainstream view, most clearly articulated by Eric Klein, treats the Bronze Age collapse as a perfect storm of multiple simultaneous stressors. The Sea Peoples' migrations, prolonged drought, internal rebellions, earthquake damage at several sites, and the cascading failure of the interconnected trade network. Klein explicitly argues that no single cause is sufficient, and that the collapse demonstrates the fragility of complex, globalized systems dependent on continuous, uninterrupted exchange. But a perfect storm of individually insufficient causes raises a harder question than it answers. Droughts had struck the eastern Mediterranean before 1200 before the Common Era. Migrations of foreign groups had occurred before. Earthquakes had struck before. The system had absorbed all of them without collapsing. What specifically changed in the decade before 1200 before the Common Era that made the same categories of stress suddenly and catastrophically fatal to every major civilization simultaneously? Some researchers ask whether the Bronze Age trading network had become so deeply, so irreversibly interconnected so dependent on precisely timed flows of copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, grain from Egypt, and luxury goods from Mesopotamia, that a disruption in any single critical node cascaded unpredictably through the entire system in ways no individual actor could have anticipated or prevented. Is the Bronze Age collapse not a story of invasion or drought or earthquake, but the first documented case in human history of systemic fragility, a warning written in the ruins of 40 cities about what happens when complexity grows faster than resilience? We may never know for certain. But the letter still in the kiln suggests someone saw it coming and had no time to send a message before it arrived. The Green Sahara and its catastrophic end. 9,000 years ago, the Sahara was not a desert. Between the Atlantic coast of modern Mauritania and the Red Sea hills of Sudan lay a landscape of lakes, rivers, forests, and open grassland, a green continent within a continent, home to hippopotamuses, crocodiles, giraffes, elephants, and tens of thousands of people who fished, herded cattle, and painted their world in extraordinary detail on sandstone cliff faces that now look out over nothing but sand. On the Tassili Najjar Plateau in southern Algeria, those paintings still exist. Hippos swimming in rivers that have been dry for 5,000 years, cattle grazing in valleys that now receive less than 10 millimeters of rainfall annually, people fishing with nets in lakes whose beds are now buried under dunes. They are not mythology, they are documentation. The Green Sahara was real, it was populated, and it ended in what may be the most consequential environmental collapse in human prehistory. Researcher Stefan Kruppelin of the University of Cologne has produced the most detailed record of the Green Sahara's decline through sediment cores extracted from Lake Yoa in northern Chad, in one of the last remnant water bodies of the ancient Saharan lake system. Those cores contain pollen, diatoms, and organic material showing continuous lake presence from approximately 14,800 years ago until approximately 5,500 years ago, with the transition to arid conditions occurring over a window of between 500 and 1,000 years. 500 years sounds gradual in human terms, but consider what 500 years of progressive desiccation means for a population without the ability to model climate systems or predict endpoints. It means your children's world is slightly drier than yours. Your grandchildren's world is slightly drier than theirs. And somewhere in that progression, a threshold is crossed that cannot be uncrossed. Satellite radar imaging has revealed the ghost of the Green Sahara beneath the sand. Nick Drake of King's College London and colleagues publishing in PLOS One in 2011 mapped a vast paleo-drainage system beneath the Libyan and Chadian desert, a network of fossil rivers, in lake beds comparable in scale to the modern Nile, confirmed by desert well data showing freshwater aquifers still present at depth, filled during the humid period and slowly depleting ever since. The rivers are still there. They just haven't carried water in 5,000 years. The cave paintings at Tassili Najjar, protected as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, depict aquatic and savanna species at elevations and distances from any modern water source that are only explicable if the landscape around them was fundamentally different from today. Fossil bones of hippopotamus, crocodile, and large catfish have been recovered from Saharan desert sites in Algeria and Libya, confirming the presence of permanent water bodies in regions that now receive essentially no rainfall. In 2008, paleontologist Paul Sereno's team discovered Gobero in the middle of the Niger desert, a site containing two cemeteries separated by approximately 1,000 years. The older cemetery, dated to between 7,700 and 6,200 years before the Common Era, contains people buried with hippopotamus tusk ornaments and freshwater fish bones. The younger cemetery, dated to between 5,200 and 4,200 years before the Common Era, contains a different population using different burial practices. The gap between them corresponds almost exactly to the most intense phase of Saharan desiccation. Two populations, two cemeteries, a desert in between. The trigger for the Green Sahara's end appears to have been orbital. Earth's axial precession, a slow wobble in the planet's rotational axis completing a full cycle approximately every 26,000 years, gradually reduced northern hemisphere summer solar insolation, weakening the West African monsoon and pulling the rain belt southward. But the response of the Saharan landscape to that trigger was not proportional or gradual. Vegetation loss increased surface, albedo, meaning the bare ground reflected more sunlight and absorbed less heat, reducing the convective uplift that drives rainfall. Less rainfall meant more vegetation loss. More vegetation loss meant more albedo. The feedback loop became self-sustaining, amplifying a subtle orbital signal into a catastrophic regional collapse. Researcher Peter Domenical and colleagues writing in Quaternary Science Reviews in 2000 documented pollen records showing almost complete vegetation replacement within as little as 200 to 400 years in some regions. Human population genetics analysis shows a population compression event in North Africa coinciding with Saharan desiccation, a movement of diverse Saharan populations toward the Nile Valley beginning approximately 6,000 to 5,000 years before the Common Era. Researcher Toby Wilkinson of Cambridge University and others have argued that this compression, culturally diverse, technologically varied populations arriving under conditions of intense ecological pressure into a single confined river valley, created the conditions for Egyptian state formation. Egypt's first dynasty emerged approximately 3,100 years before the Common Era, roughly 2,000 years after peak Green Sahara conditions, but within the window of maximum population pressure toward the Nile following desiccation. The mainstream view acknowledges Saharan depopulation as a contributing factor to Nile Valley population growth while attributing Egyptian state formation to multiple interacting agricultural, political, and social drivers. But some researchers ask a harder question. If ancient Egypt was built by refugees, if the civilization that produced the pyramids, hieroglyphics, and the world's first monumental stone architecture emerged directly from the compression of already sophisticated Saharan cultures into a confined ecological zone where ideas collided under conditions of resource scarcity and demographic pressure, then is catastrophe not the enemy of civilization, but its engine? Is the comfortable assumption that great cultures arise from stable abundance simply wrong? The green. Sahara's bones lie beneath the dunes. The people who once lived there built something that outlasted the world they lost. What does that say about what catastrophe actually does to the human species? The Minoan eruption of Thera. The city on the island of Thera was sophisticated in a way that still surprises archaeologists. Multi-story buildings with fitted stone, frescoed walls depicting dolphins, women in elaborate dress, young men boxing, fleets of decorated ships, drainage systems running beneath the streets, evidence of a literate cosmopolitan trading culture connected to Egypt, the Levant, and mainland Greece. The residents of what is now called Akrotiri appear to have evacuated before the end came, because no human remains have been found in the ruins despite the extraordinary completeness of preservation. And they took their people and their most portable valuables, and they left. And then the island tore itself apart. Sometime in the 17th or 16th century before the Common Era, a volcanic island in the heart of the Aegean Sea detonated in one of the largest eruptions in the last 10,000 years. The Minoan eruption of Thera is classified as a VEI-6 or VEI-7 event, ejecting an estimated 60 cubic kilometers of magma into the atmosphere. That makes it roughly 4 times the size of the 1883 Krakatoa eruption, which killed tens of thousands and produced the loudest sound in recorded history. The eruption column from Thera is estimated to have reached 36 kilometers into the stratosphere based on the distribution of tephra, volcanic ash confirmed in sediment cores across the eastern Mediterranean, the Nile Delta, and the Black Sea. The island's central caldera collapsed into the sea during or after the eruption, generating tsunamis that reached the coast of Crete, home of the Minoan civilization, the first great maritime empire of the Western world, within minutes of the collapse. Archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos began systematic excavation of Akrotiri in 1967, revealing a Bronze Age city buried under volcanic ash in a state of preservation comparable to Pompeii. The frescoes recovered from Akrotiri are among the most sophisticated artworks of the Bronze Age. The city's plumbing system suggests a level of civic engineering that was genuinely advanced for its period. And the absence of human remains confirms that the eruption was preceded by warning signs that allowed evacuation, a fact that makes the scale of subsequent destruction even more striking. The people escaped. The civilization ultimately did not. Here is where the mystery deepens. Two independent and highly reliable scientific dating methods produced 2 different dates for this eruption, separated by approximately 100 years, and no one has fully reconciled them. Radiocarbon dating of an olive tree branch buried by the eruption at Thera, analyzed by Walter Friedrich and colleagues and published in Science in 2006, produced a date of 1627 to 1600 before the Common Era. A comprehensive radiocarbon study of short-lived plant material from multiple sites, led by Sturt Manning of Cornell University and also published in Science in 2006, supports the same early date. Ice cores from both Greenland and Antarctica record a major sulfuric acid deposition event dated to approximately 1644 before the Common Era in Greenland and 1623 before the Common Era in Antarctica, consistent with a massive stratospheric volcanic eruption at roughly this time. But the archaeological evidence from Egypt, the Aegean, and the Levant consistently places the eruption around 1500 before the Common Era, 100 to 150 years later. 2 reliable scientific methods, a 100-year gap. One of them requires revision. Chinese records from the Bamboo Annals describe a yellow fog, a dim sun, frost in July, and famine in approximately 1618 before the Common Era, consistent with the hemispheric climate effects of a major stratospheric volcanic injection. Egyptian records from the reign of Ahmose I include what is now called the Tempus Stela, a text describing catastrophic storms, prolonged darkness, and flooding so severe that the gods expressed their wrath, interpreted by some researchers, including Robert Rittner and Miriam Moeller, in a 2014 analysis as a contemporary Egyptian record of Thera's atmospheric aftermath. The Minoan civilization's palace centers at Knossos, Akrotiri, Tau and Phaistos show destruction layers and abandonment episodes within a 50 to 100-year window following either dating of the eruption, with final collapse of Minoan political independence attributed to Mycenaean takeover around 1450 before the Common Era. The mainstream archaeological view accepts the eruption as a major catastrophe that severely damaged coastal Minoan settlements and disrupted regional trade, contributing significantly to Minoan weakening. Most scholars do not attribute the final collapse of Minoan civilization to the eruption alone, treating Mycenaean invasion and internal fragmentation as equally important factors. The Atlantis connection, the theory that Plato's account of a powerful island civilization destroyed suddenly and sinking beneath the sea was inspired by Thera, was treated as culturally interesting but speculative. But the 100-year dating discrepancy is not a rounding error. If the radiocarbon dates are correct and the eruption happened in 1628 before the Common Era, then the entire Bronze Age chronology for Egypt, the Levant, and the Aegean is misaligned by a century, meaning the pharaohs, kings, and trade records of the entire region have been incorrectly cross-referenced for decades of scholarship. And if the archaeological dates are correct, something else caused the acid layer in the ice cores at 1628 before the Common Era, something equally large and equally unstudied. Some researchers ask whether Plato's Atlantis, written in 360 before the Common Era and describing a powerful island civilization destroyed suddenly and absorbed by the sea, encodes a 9,000-year-old oral tradition of the Theran disaster, garbled by transmission but real at its core. Others ask whether the 10-to-1 ratio Plato applies, describing Atlantis as 9,000 years before his time rather than 900, is simply a scribal error or mistranslation that has obscured the true referent for 2.5 millennia. We may never resolve it. But the Akrotiri frescoes still glow with color. The people who painted them got out in time. Their civilization didn't. The Zanclean Flood. 5.5 million years ago, the Mediterranean Sea did not exist. For at least 270,000 years, possibly longer, the Mediterranean basin had evaporated almost entirely, leaving behind a vast, superheated desert sitting 3 to 5 kilometers below sea level. Salt deposits accumulated on its floor to depths of 3 kilometers. In some regions, the basin floor was hotter than almost anywhere on the surface of the modern Earth, a hellscape of white salt flats and blistering heat, sitting silently below the level of the ocean beyond the rim of rock at Gibraltar. Elephant-like proboscideans and ancestral horses wandered terrain that would later become the floor of the Sicilian Channel, the Adriatic, and the Tyrrhenian Sea. And then, approximately 5,300,000 years ago, the Atlantic Ocean found a weakness in the land bridge at Gibraltar. What followed may be the most violent flood event in the known history of the planet. The event is called the Zanclean Flood, named for the Zanclean Age of the Pliocene. The Mediterranean's prior disappearance is called the Messinian Salinity Crisis, a period lasting from approximately 5,960,000 to 5,330,000 years ago, during which the ancestral Mediterranean became progressively isolated from the Atlantic as the African and Eurasian tectonic plates converged, ultimately severing the seaways that had connected the basin to the open ocean. As evaporation outpaced any remaining inflow, the basin shrank. Then it nearly vanished. The evidence is the evaporates, salt and gypsum deposits up to 3 kilometers thick on the floor of the modern Mediterranean, confirmed by deep-sea drilling during the Deep Sea Drilling Project in the 1970s, with key analysis by Kenneth Ack of ETH Zurich, whose 1983 book on the subject brought the discovery to scientific attention. The mechanism of the Zanclean flood was first quantitatively modeled by Daniel Garcia Castellanos of the Spanish National Research Council, publishing a landmark paper in Nature in 2009. Garcia Castellanos and colleagues used seismic imaging of the bedrock beneath the Strait of Gibraltar to identify a buried feature they called the Zanclean Erosion Channel, a valley carved into bedrock by the catastrophic passage of Atlantic water into the dry Mediterranean basin. The channel extends approximately 200 kilometers, with incision depths reaching 250 meters below the current seafloor, cut through solid rock by the energy of the inflow. Rock is not eroded 250 meters deep by a trickle. The shape of the Zanclean channel is the shape left by something moving at extraordinary velocity for an extended period. Garcia Castellanos' hydraulic modeling estimated peak water flow through the Gibraltar Breach at approximately 100 times the combined discharge of all of Earth's modern rivers simultaneously. The Mediterranean basin sat 3 to 5 kilometers below the Atlantic surface, creating an enormous hydraulic head, and as the initial breach eroded and widened, the flow rate would have increased in a self-reinforcing cycle. The total volume of water transferred from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean during the Zanclean refilling is estimated at approximately 3.7 million cubic kilometers, comparable to the volume of the Arctic Ocean. As the Mediterranean filled, Atlantic sea level dropped by an estimated 10 meters globally, a change detectable in sediment records from ocean basins far from the event. Terrestrial fossil evidence from the Mycenaean period confirms that the dry Mediterranean basin was inhabited. Deep drill cores recover terrestrial pollen, river sediment, and fossil remains of land-dwelling mammals from what is now the deep Mediterranean seafloor, confirming that animals lived and died on terrain now buried under kilometers of salt water. Proboscideans, ancestral horses, and other Miocene megafauna roamed this basin during the salinity crisis. When the Zanclean flood began, they would have had no escape from what was coming. The question that cannot yet be answered is how quickly the transition from seepage to catastrophe occurred. The mainstream geological view accepts the Zanclean flood as a real and geologically dramatic event. The debate concerns rate. Most models favor a refilling that occurred over thousands of years rather than months, with gradual erosion of the Gibraltar sill preceding catastrophic breakthrough. This is viewed as a well-understood consequence of plate tectonic geometry, dramatic in scale, but explicable within conventional geology. But the erosion channel's morphology continues to challenge the gradual model. The depth of bedrock incision, 250 meters, and the channel's narrow, high-velocity profile suggest flow rates that cannot be produced by gentle, long-duration seepage. Some models suggest the initial breach may have been small, perhaps meters wide, with erosion rapidly enlarging it within years or decades, producing a transition from seepage to cataclysm that occurred within a human-observable time frame. If the refilling began slowly and then accelerated catastrophically, the opening phase might have been witnessed. The Miocene apes and ancestral horses that lived in the basin would have experienced rising water that began as an anomaly and became a catastrophe in the space of a lifetime, or less. No human eye was there to see it. But 5 million years later, in a disaster built on the same dynamics, a different kind of water catastrophe would consume a different landscape, and the people who survived it would tell the story for thousands of years, for the Storegga submarine landslide and the drowning of Doggerland. 8,200 years ago, Britain was not an island. Between what is now the English coastline and the coast of Denmark lay a country-sized landmass the size of modern Great Britain, connected to continental Europe by a plain of rivers, marshes, rolling hills, and dense temperate forest. Archaeologist Brian E. Coles named it Doggerland in 1998 after the Dogger Bank, the shallow underwater ridge in the North Sea where fishing trawlers have been pulling up Mesolithic artifacts, animal bones, and ancient peat for over a century. Doggerland had rivers. It had a large central lagoon system. It had elevated terrain. And it had people, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who had lived there for generations, whose tools and bones and harpoon points are still being dredged from the seafloor today. A harpoon point recovered from the Dogger Bank has been dated to approximately 11,740 years ago, confirming sustained human habitation long before the end came. Then, in a matter of hours, the end came. Approximately 300 kilometers off the coast of Norway, a section of the continental slope broke free. The Storegga Slide, now mapped in precise detail by Norwegian Petroleum Geology surveys, left a scar on the seabed measuring approximately 290 kilometers wide at its head and extending over 800 kilometers across the Norwegian sea floor. An estimated 3,500 cubic kilometers of sediment, roughly equivalent to the volume of Iceland, displaced into the deep ocean in what geologists classify as one of the largest submarine mass movements ever documented. The tsunamis generated by that displacement were not advisory level waves. They were walls of water. Tsunami deposits from the Storegga event have been identified and dated by Stein Bondevik and colleagues, publishing in Quaternary Science Reviews in 2003 at Coastal Exposures and Sediment Cores in Scotland, Norway, the Shetland Islands, and the Faroe Islands. In the Shetlands, the tsunami sediment layer reaches elevations of up to 20 meters above sea level. Radiocarbon dating of organic material within the deposit places the event at approximately 8,150 years ago, plus or minus 250 years, placing it squarely in the period when Doggerland was still inhabited. A 20-meter wave arriving at a flat, low-lying coastal plain with no high ground within reach of the central lowlands does not leave survivors on that plain. Professor Vince Gaffney of the University of Bradford has led the Europe's Lost Frontiers project, which processed over 150,000 square kilometers of oil industry seismic survey data to reconstruct the Doggerland landscape in 3 dimensions. The project has identified river networks, elevated terrain, and what appears to be a large central lagoon system in the southern North Sea basin connected to what may have been the last high ground before inundation. Fishing trawlers operating in the North Sea have recovered over 100 Mesolithic artifacts from Doggerland sediment over the decades, including worked flint tools, animal bones, and ancient peat containing plant material that grew 8,000 years ago on land that is now under 30 to 40 meters of water. At the time of the Storegga event, global sea levels were already rising due to ongoing glacial melt from the last ice age. Doggerland was already shrinking year by year, generation by generation. The central lowlands were already becoming shallower, the eastern connections to the continent already narrowing. The Storegga tsunami did not initiate the end of Doggerland. It accelerated it catastrophically, converting what might have been centuries of further habitation into hours of catastrophe for the populations living on the coastal plain. The mainstream archaeological view treats the inundation of Doggerland as a process, a gradual sea level rise punctuated by the Storegga tsunami, with the tsunami likely destroying coastal communities but not necessarily eliminating all populations instantaneously. Elevated ground and migration to what is now the British mainland or continental Europe may have allowed some populations to survive. But the material cultural record of Mesolithic Doggerland simply stops. Not migrates, stops. The specific toolkit, the specific settlement patterns, the specific cultural signatures of Doggerland's inhabitants do not reappear in clearly recognizable form in subsequent British or continental European Mesolithic populations. They were absorbed into surrounding groups or they were lost. Some researchers ask whether the concept of a drowned ancestral homeland, appearing independently in Norse, British, and continental European mythological traditions, represents a memory of Storegga and Doggerland, carried in story for 8,000 years by cultures with no writing system. If pre-literate peoples could encode detailed flood memories in oral tradition and transmit them with geographic specificity across dozens of generations, What does that tell us about what other catastrophes might be hiding in mythology? The Dogger Bank still yields its artifacts to fishing nets. Every trawler that brings up a Mesolithic flint tool is pulling something out of a drowned world that most people have never heard of. The Lachamp's geomagnetic excursion. 42,000 years ago, Earth's magnetic field, the invisible force field generated by the churning of liquid iron in the planet's outer core, the shield that deflects lethal solar wind and cosmic radiation away from everything alive on the surface, began to fail. It had weakened before and strengthened again. But this time, it kept weakening. Over the course of approximately 1,000 years, the field dropped to somewhere between 0 and 6% of its modern strength. The auroras, normally confined to the polar regions, blazed across the tropics. Ultraviolet radiation from the sun reached the surface at levels unprecedented in the span of human existence. The sky to anyone looking up would have been luminous with phenomena that had no precedent in living memory or ancestral story. And in that 1,000-year window, at least 2 species of human disappeared, the megafauna of an entire continent went extinct, and our own ancestors began suddenly and inexplicably to make art. The Lachamp's excursion, named for a site of anomalously magnetized lava flows near Lachamps, France, was first identified in the 1960s and dated to approximately 41,000 years ago. The critical breakthrough came in 2021 when a team led by Professor Alan Cooper, working with Dr. Chris Turney at the University of New South Wales, published a paper in Science using a source of data that no previous study had employed: ancient kauri trees from New Zealand. Kauri trees, Agathis australis, are among the longest-lived tree species on Earth, and specimens preserved in northern New Zealand bogs for over 40,000 years retain intact annual growth rings. Those rings record atmospheric concentrations of carbon-14, which spike when the magnetic field weakens because more cosmic radiation penetrates the atmosphere and produces more carbon-14 through interactions with nitrogen. The Kauri records provided the most detailed year-by-year account ever assembled of the Lachamp field collapse, and Cooper's team named the event the Adams Event after author Douglas Adams. During the Adams event, atmospheric carbon-14 concentrations reached levels approximately 50% higher than modern values, while confirming unprecedented penetration of cosmic radiation to Earth's surface. The geomagnetic field strength dropped to as low as 0 to 6% of its modern value, meaning anyone outdoors during the peak weakness was exposed to cosmic radiation at levels with no modern analog. The weakened field would have caused dramatic expansion of the ozone hole, triggering prolonged atmospheric disruption, increased UV exposure at the surface, and according to computer modeling by Cooper's team, severe droughts across parts of the northern hemisphere through disruption of atmospheric circulation patterns. Neanderthals, who had survived in Europe for approximately 400,000 years and had demonstrably coexisted with anatomically modern humans for at least 10,000 years before the Adams event, disappear from the archaeological record within the Lachamp window. After 400,000 years of survival through multiple glaciations, ice ages, and environmental upheavals, they are gone, specifically within the period when the shield that protects the surface of the Earth from space was nearly absent. 13 genera of Australian megafauna, including Diprotodon, a wombat the size of a rhinoceros, and the giant wombat Phascolonus, go extinct in the same time frame, consistent with UV-induced disruption of plant communities and food chains across the continent. And then there is the art. The oldest confirmed cave art in Europe, including the Chauvet cave paintings in southern France, dated to approximately 36,000 to 37,000 years before the Common Era, appears immediately following the Adams event. With it comes a dramatic increase in the use of ochre, personal ornaments, beads, and evidence of long-distance trade in symbolic objects. The modern human behavioral revolution, the explosion of symbolic complexity that archaeologists have puzzled over for decades, emerges from the other side of the Adams event. The mainstream view treats the Lachance excursion as a measurable geomagnetic event that, while real, did not necessarily cause the megafaunal extinctions or Neanderthal disappearance on its own. Most paleoanthropologists attribute Neanderthal extinction primarily to competitive pressure from anatomically modern humans, and the Australian extinctions to a combination of climate change and early human hunting. But Neanderthals had coexisted with modern humans for at least 10,000 years before the Adams event without disappearing. They had survived every previous glacial maximum that climate records show. They vanished specifically within the 1,000-year window, when Earth's magnetic shield was closest to non-existent. And modern humans, the species that survived, demonstrably changed their behavior during the event, producing symbolic art, using ochre, and spending extraordinary amounts of time in deep caves that happen to provide shielding from surface radiation. Some researchers ask whether the explosion of cave art represents not a spiritual awakening, not a cognitive leap, but a survival adaptation, a record of a species spending far more time underground because something above ground had become dangerous. Whether Neanderthals simply lacked the behavioral flexibility to make the same adaptation, or whether they lacked the population density to find shelter in sufficient numbers, we cannot yet say. But the kauri tree rings record every year of the field's collapse in carbon, and the year the field hit its minimum is the same century Neanderthals stop appearing in the fossil record. The Toba supervolcanic eruption. 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, a volcano that had been building pressure for hundreds of thousands of years finally gave way. The eruption lasted approximately 2 weeks. In that time, it ejected an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, more than any other volcanic event in the last 2 million years. The ash cloud spread across the Indian Ocean, South Asia, and the Arabian Peninsula. In parts of central India, the ash layer is up to 9 meters thick. The sulfur dioxide injected into the stratosphere has been estimated at 1 billion tons, triggering a volcanic winter in which global temperatures may have dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius on average, with some regional estimates reaching 15 degrees. The sun effectively disappeared for somewhere between 1 and 6 years. And somewhere in the years and decades that followed, the human population may have been reduced to a number small enough to fit inside a single modern sports stadium. The Toba eruption is classified as a VEI8 event, the highest category on the Volcanic Explosivity Index. Ash from the eruption has been identified in sediment cores from the Bay of Bengal, the Arabian Sea, the South China Sea, and in terrestrial sites from India, Malaysia, and East Africa, confirming its genuinely global atmospheric dispersal. The initial connection between the Toba eruption and human genetic history was proposed by geneticist Stanley Ambrose of the University of Illinois in a landmark 1998 paper in the Journal of Human Evolution. Ambrose observed that modern humans, despite numbering 8 billion individuals spread across every continent, show dramatically lower genetic diversity than chimpanzees, whose global population is a fraction of ours. The only mechanism capable of producing this anomalous genetic uniformity in a species as widespread as Homo sapiens is a catastrophic population bottleneck, a period during which the breeding population was reduced to a number small enough that the surviving gene pool was extremely narrow. The mitochondrial DNA analysis underlying Ambrose's hypothesis implies humanity was reduced to as few as 3,000 to 10,000 breeding individuals at some point between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago, a window that encompasses the Toba eruption. If the bottleneck was caused by Toba, that means every human being alive today, all 8 billion of us, descends from a population that at its lowest point may have been smaller than the current population of a small town. The researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology have refined these estimates using mitochondrial and Y chromosome analysis, confirming the extreme narrowness of human genetic diversity compared to other great apes, a pattern consistent with a severe founding bottleneck. Archaeological evidence from India adds a specific and unresolved puzzle. Sites below the Toba ash layer contain stone tools consistent with the populations living in South Asia before the eruption. Sites above the ash layer contain tools that are distinctly different in character. Researcher Michael Petraglia of Oxford and colleagues, publishing in Science in 2007, documented this discontinuity and argued that it suggests either a completely different human population occupied South Asia after Toba, meaning the pre-eruption population was eliminated and replaced, or that the surviving population underwent such a dramatic cultural reset that their technology became unrecognizable. Either interpretation is extraordinary. Evidence of human survival through the Toba event has been found at Pinnacle Point on the southern coast of South Africa, where Curtis Marian of Arizona State University and colleagues documented shellfish-eating coastal communities that appear to have persisted through the eruption period, suggesting that marine food sources insulated from the volcanic winter by ocean thermal mass may have served as a survival refuge for at least some human groups. The mainstream paleoanthropological view acknowledges Toba as a significant environmental stress event, but remains divided on the severity of the genetic bottleneck. Many researchers argue that multiple small founder populations survived in isolated refugia across Africa and Asia, and that the genetic evidence for a bottleneck reflects pre-existing demographic structure rather than Toba specifically. Some recent studies using larger genomic datasets have argued the bottleneck signal is less severe than Ambrose's original estimate suggested. But if comfortable, geographically distributed refugia allowed large populations to survive Toba without catastrophic reduction, the anomalously low genetic diversity of modern humans compared to every other great ape remains unexplained. The refugia model requires those populations to have been remarkably small enough that the difference between the survival of the human lineage and its extinction may have been a coastal cave, a reliable shellfish bed, and several thousand years of extraordinary luck. What emerged from that survival was a species that would, 60,000 years later, paint caves, cross oceans, build cities, and eventually reconstruct the catastrophe that nearly ended it from chemical signatures in ancient ice. But before we arrived at any of that, something else happened, 60,000 years after Toba and 40,000 years before recorded history, that may have done more to shape the world we live in today than any single event in the human story. The Younger Dryas Impact Event. 12,800 years ago, across 4 continents simultaneously, something changed. The change was not gradual. The change was not ambiguous. In sediment cores, in lake beds, in ice cores drilled from the Greenland ice sheet, in the dried beds of ancient desert lakes, in cliff face exposures from California to the Carolina coast, to the Netherlands to Syria, there exists a thin layer, a few centimeters thick at most, that marks a boundary as sharp as a line drawn with a ruler. Below that line, one world, above it, another. The layer is rich in materials that should not be there. Platinum, at concentrations 100 times background levels. Nanodiamonds, a form of carbon that requires pressures exceeding 200,000 atmospheres to form, are found in sediment from New Mexico to Chile to Belgium. Iron spherules produced at temperatures exceeding those of any known volcanic event. Shocked quartz grains bearing the deformation patterns of hypervelocity impact. And melt glass, recovered from a site in Syria, showing peak formation temperatures exceeding 2,200 degrees Celsius. Below the layer, the Clovis culture, mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, short-faced bears, American horses. Above the layer, none of them. This layer exists at more than 52 confirmed sites on 6 continents, all dating to precisely 12,800 years ago. The Younger Dryas boundary layer was first formally documented by a team of 26 researchers led by Richard Firestone of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in a landmark 2007 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Firestone's team identified the distinctive chemical signature at sites across North America and proposed that it represented the debris layer of a cosmic impact or airburst event of extraordinary scale. In the years since, the evidence has been confirmed and expanded by researchers at the University of California, Santa Barbara, the University of Edinburgh, and independent teams in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Chile. By 2023, the Younger Dryas boundary layer had been identified at over 52 sites on 6 continents, each independently dated, each containing the same anomalous chemical combination. The probability of 52 geographically separated sites independently accumulating the same impossible combination of platinum, nanodiamonds, shocked quartz, and high-temperature melt glass through unrelated processes at the same geological instant is statistically not a serious alternative. The Younger Dryas cold period that followed lasted approximately 1,200 years, from 10,900 to 9,700 before the Common Era. During this period, temperatures in Greenland dropped by an estimated 10 to 15 degrees Celsius within decades, a rate of change far faster than any orbital or solar explanation can account for. The climate of the Northern Hemisphere was plunged back into near-glacial conditions almost instantly in geological terms after thousands of years of warming following the last glacial maximum. Mikhail Petayev of Harvard and colleagues, publishing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2013, identified platinum concentration spikes in Greenland ice cores at the Younger Dryas boundary layer 100 times higher than background levels, a signature consistent with the impact or airburst of a platinum-rich extraterrestrial body, the kind of body found in certain classes of comets and carbonaceous asteroids. Over 35 genera of megafauna went extinct in North America alone during the Younger Dryas transition, including woolly mammoths, mastodons, short-faced bears, American horses, and the giant ground sloth, one of the most dramatic mammal extinction events of the Cenozoic era. The Clovis culture, North America's most widespread documented pre-Columbian civilization, present at sites from Montana to Mexico and representing tens of thousands of years of accumulated cultural knowledge, abruptly disappears from the archaeological record at the Younger Dryas boundary layer. There is no confirmed successor culture for at least 300 years. A people simply absent from the record. At Abu Huraira in northern Syria, one of the earliest known agricultural settlements, researchers led by Andrew Moore of Rochester Institute of Technology and James Kennett of the University of California, Santa Barbara, publishing in Scientific Reports in 2020, recovered melt glass and cosmic spherules from the Younger Dryas boundary layer showing peak formation temperatures exceeding 2,200 degrees Celsius. Those temperatures cannot be produced by cooking fires, lightning strikes, or volcanic events. They require something falling from above with kinetic energy sufficient to flash the ground surface itself into glass in fractions of a second. The settlement at Abu Huraira shows a destruction layer at this horizon. An early agricultural community, one of the first in human history, ended at the same geological instant as the mammoths, the Clovis people, and the climate of the Holocene. The prior mainstream explanation for the Younger Dryas attributed the cold period to a disruption of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation caused by the catastrophic drainage of glacial Lake Agassiz into the North Atlantic, flooding it with fresh water and shutting down the ocean conveyor belt that moderates Northern Hemisphere climate. This is a well-supported mechanism that explains the Younger Dryas temperature signature reasonably well. Many researchers continue to favor it, or some combination of freshwater forcing and cosmic impact, as the most defensible model. The impact hypothesis remains contested within the scientific community, with some researchers challenging the interpretation of the chemical markers. But the freshwater disruption model does not explain the nanodiamonds. It does not explain the shocked quartz appearing simultaneously in Pennsylvania and Syria. It does not explain why the platinum spike in Greenland ice cores occurs at a concentration 100 times background that cannot be produced by terrestrial volcanism. It does not explain the melt glass at Abu Huraira. And it does not explain why the Clovis culture, the mammoths, and an early agricultural settlement in Syria all end at the same geological instant across thousands of kilometers of separation, in a layer defined by materials that require energies only achievable by something arriving from space. Some researchers ask what a fragmented comet, something analogous to the Shoemaker-Levy 9 comet that struck Jupiter across multiple entry points in 1994, yet would look like in the sediment record if it had entered Earth's atmosphere at a shallow angle and detonated across multiple simultaneous airburst events. They ask whether the fire in the sky encoded in the origin stories of dozens of indigenous cultures across North America is metaphor or the oldest oral history on the continent. They ask what the Clovis people were, how complex their culture actually was, and what was permanently destroyed when they disappeared from the record. And they ask the hardest question of all. If an event of this scale happened 12,800 years ago and left behind 52 sites of evidence on 6 continents, and still cannot be fully explained or agreed upon by the scientific community, what does that tell us about how little we actually know about the deepest chapters of our own story? Consider what we've traveled through together. A cosmic impact that may have ended a civilization and erased 40 species simultaneously. A genetic bottleneck that nearly collapsed the human lineage into extinction. A magnetic field failure that killed the Neanderthals and drove our ancestors underground to make art. A supervolcano that turned a Mediterranean basin into a desert, and then watched the Atlantic Ocean fill it in one of the most violent floods in planetary history. A lost country beneath the North Sea, swallowed in hours. A Bronze Age eruption that may have been the seed of the world's oldest legend. A green continent that dried into sand, and in drying may have built the civilization we still call ancient Egypt. 50 years that ended every palace culture in the eastern Mediterranean without a confirmed cause. A freshwater sea that became salt water and may have written the oldest story humanity ever told. And a thin black layer of sediment, 12,800 years old, containing materials that cannot exist, found on 6 continents, marking the end of one world and the beginning of ours. These are not isolated anomalies scattered across unrelated chapters of deep time. They are a pattern. They are the grammar of a planet that has never been stable, never been safe, and never stopped changing in ways that dwarf anything in recorded human history. The mainstream scientific view, and it deserves to be stated plainly, has done extraordinary work to identify, date, and analyze these events. The sediment cores, the ice cores, the radiocarbon dates, the genetic studies, these are genuine achievements of human inquiry, and the events they describe are real. Where the mainstream view and the questions raised by researchers at the edges of these fields diverge is not on the facts, but on the implications, on what it means that the world we live in is not the default world, on what it means that our species is here at all, given how many times the conditions for our existence have been narrowed to a thread. The philosophical reflection hiding inside every one of these items is the same. We are not the inevitable product of a stable, hospitable planet progressing smoothly toward complexity. We are the survivors of catastrophes we never knew happened, shaped by disasters we have only recently begun to reconstruct. The languages we speak, the myths we tell, the civilizations we inherited, and the continents we inhabit were all formed in fire, flood, cold, and ash. And most people walk through the world assuming it was always basically like this, that the oceans were always where they are, that Britain was always an island, that the Sahara was always sand, that the Mediterranean was always wet. You know better now. You know that every stable-looking feature of the modern world is the temporary result of forces that have reshaped everything before and will reshape it again. This channel exists for people who refuse to accept the surface of things, for people who look at a landscape and ask what it used to be, for people who read a myth and wonder what memory it's carrying. If that's you, subscribe. And tell me in the comments, which of these events do you think left the deepest mark on the human story? The answer you give says something about how you understand what we actually are. Every map ever drawn is a lie, not in its measurements, but in its assumption of permanence. The Mediterranean was a desert. The Sahara was green. Britain was a peninsula. The Black Sea was fresh. And the sky above our ancestors glowed with radiation that killed species and drove survivors underground to make the first art anyone ever made. The world you were born into was assembled from catastrophe, shaped by events so vast and so violent that they still haven't been fully explained, handed to you as though it had always been this way. It hasn't. It was built in fire and flood and darkness. It survived. So did the people inside it, and so, somehow, did the stories. Subscribe if you want to keep following them. You want to keep